We're happy to welcome today Leah Findlater, who will be talking about the augmented abilities through wearable technologies. How can wearable technologies be used to transform the accessibility of everyday activities for people with disability? And this talk will provide an overview of their research at the Human-Computer Interaction Lab with an in-depth look at using head-mounted display to support communication. And just to give you a little bit of a background of Leah, she's an assistant professor in the College of Information Studies, an affiliate professor in the Department of Computer Science, and a member of the Inclusive Design Group at the Human-Computer Interaction Lab. Leah, welcome.
Hello, everyone. So I'll be talking to you today about our research on augmenting abilities through new wearable technologies. So our daily lives consist of numerous yet critical actions, connecting with loved ones or with strangers, shopping to prepare a favorite meal, reading a piece of mail, or taking the bus to work. Depending on an individual's cognitive, sensory, or physical abilities, though, these kinds of activities may be difficult or even impossible. Take a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, for example. Oral group conversations can be difficult if the person is having trouble following quick transitions from one speaker to the next, say across the room or behind them. The reason is that somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing in such a setting would be using visual cues such as lip reading or speech reading. Consider another example. So a blind person who is shopping to prepare a meal might need to purchase a can of chickpeas or a can of, versus a can of black beans, or say mild salsa versus hot salsa. These cans or bottles feel similar, and the only differences are visual until you've opened them up. So how can we address that kind of problem? These are examples of real-world accessibility challenges that we're addressing in our research group. We're looking at questions such as how can we sense and feedback sound information for a person who is deaf or hard of hearing? Or how can we augment a blind person's physical sense of touch by, to help them interpret non-tactile information? How can we support a person with a language impairment in finding a difficult word when needed? Now, by we, I mean myself and my students at the Inclusive Design Lab, of course, along with collaborators. We are a research group within the College of Information Studies and the Human-Computer Interaction Lab here at the University of Maryland. And the students come from information studies as well as computer science. Our general approach is to design, build, and evaluate new technologies that support diverse user abilities, those cognitive, sensory, and physical abilities through personalization, and augment those abilities, enhance those abilities through augmentation. I'm going to give you an overview of 3 specific research projects today that look at augmenting abilities. One focuses on users who are deaf or hard of hearing, providing sound awareness information. Another one focuses on providing language support to users with an acquired cognitive impairment. And a third project focuses on supporting people with visual impairments through augmenting their physical touch. And I'm going to go into the first 2 of these in much more depth than the third one. So let's get started with this first one. People who are deaf or hard of hearing make use of visual cues like facial expressions and gestures when they're conversing with hearing conversation partners in oral conversations. To be able to make use of these visual cues, which is called speech reading or lip reading, though, the user needs to know where to focus their visual attention. So you can't make use of someone's facial expression if you don't know that this person is talking versus this person over here. Now, underscoring the importance of this problem, I want to play you a little video clip here from one of the participants in our studies.
I can't keep up with everything that everyone says, especially when it goes back and forth too quickly.
So this is somebody who has profound hearing loss discussing the difficulty of following the conversation in these group conversation settings. Hearing aids and surgically implanted devices are good at improving sound recognition, but typically don't address this problem of sound localization, needing to know that a sound came from a particular direction so that you can then turn and look at it. prior work in human-computer interaction, which is my field, has focused mostly on how we can sense and feedback non-speech sound information and provides this information on an external display. So what you're looking at here on the screen is a top-down view of an office setting, and there are ripples that appear on the screen when sound occurs. So here we have ripples showing a non-speech sound from a computer, from a phone ringing, and then from somebody knocking at the door. As I said, this is information that appears on an external display, a fixed display. So this is great maybe if you're sitting at your desk working, but as soon as you turn around or you get up to leave the room, it's not going to help you anymore. So more recently, people have begun to look at wearable sensing and feedback solutions to provide this sound awareness information. And this is one example. This is a wrist-worn device by Kaneko et al. That provides low-fidelity feedback information about when sound occurs. So there are 4 LED lights on this wrist-worn device, and this gives information that sound has come from one of 4 cardinal directions. So in addition to the low fidelity, an issue with this particular solution is that because it's located on the wrist, if the wearer is in mid-conversation, they need to actually divert their gaze away from their conversation partner in order to make use of that information on the wrist. So our approach instead is to explore how we can provide sound visualizations on a head-mounted display, or HMD. So if you see HMD on my slides throughout this talk, that's what that means. Our goals are, in using an HMD, are to provide glanceable support, so that display is right there. You can look at your conversation partner up at the display very easily. And also private support, so that visual information is seen by you, the wearer, but is not seen by people you're speaking with, and they might not even be aware that you're viewing some sound support. So let's take an example here. Imagine you're sitting at a table with 4 other people, and you're wearing this head-mounted display, Google Glass. Here I'm showing a shot of what would be shown on the screen as different people around the table speak. So someone to your right speaks, some ripples appear on the right-hand side of the display. Someone in front of you speaks, you get some ripples there in front, and then someone comes in behind you, enters the room, and you see some ripples at the bottom of the display. So the ripples are just one way in which we could implement this kind of sound visualization. And you can imagine there are all kinds of different ways of doing this. So that's what we investigated in our first study. We've actually conducted 2 studies here, and the first one looked at this question of how should these visualizations be designed. And then the second study, we looked at how a much smaller number of participants react to a working prototype. So let's start with this first study. For this study, we recruited 24 participants who have hearing loss. 20 had profound hearing loss, and 19 of those used lip reading. On average, they were 38 years old, and there were half males, half females. The participants completed both semi-structured interviews to start with, so looking at what kinds of problems they encounter in group conversations and what strategies they're using to accommodate those problems. And then a second part where they interacted with design probes on an iPad and Google Glass. So a design probe is meant to give the participant a sense of what this technology might be like so that they can think about how it would fit into their lives, good things, bad things, but it's not actually a fully working prototype. With the design probes, participants provided feedback on a whole range of possible sound visualizations. What we did was we identified 8 design dimensions that we thought were particularly important for this group conversation scenario, and we had participants give feedback on options within each of these dimensions. I'm not going to go through all of these, and I don't expect you to be able to read them all from the back of the room here. So let me give you one example. Directional granularity. Here we looked at 4 different options. At one end of the spectrum, 1 level of directional granularity, so simply did a sound occur or not. All the way at the other end of the spectrum, we looked at continuous directional granularity, so knowing very precisely that a sound came from this angle or this angle or this angle. We implemented these design options using 2 scenarios. The first one is that group conversation around the table. And then the second one is a classroom scenario where you have an instructor and then multiple people speaking in the classroom, multiple students. Throughout, we collected preference data on the designs and as well as open-ended rationale for why people had those preferences. So for the preference data, we used chi-square tests to analyze the data. And then for the open-ended rationale and other questions, we transcribed and coded these and used an iterative coding process with 2 independent coders. So let me give you some overview of the findings from this study. First of all, All 24 participants thought that the idea of head-mounted display sound visualizations were useful. And more specifically, here's a quote from one of the participants. He said, for using these visualizations in a group conversation scenario, it would reduce the amount of time and effort to find the individual speaking and lead to less content loss. So more efficient communication and richer communication. Another outcome from this research was a set of specific design recommendations. We have 8 of them. Again, no need to go through them all, but I will highlight a few. So directional granularity, again, let's come back to that one. Our recommendation here is that precision is valued, so use high directional granularity at least 8 level, which is 45-degree increments, if not continuous. And you may be wondering, why wouldn't we just always use continuous? Well, from the sensing perspective, there may be some limitations there in terms of how accurate the sensing is, able to detect where sound came from. And then from the feedback perspective, maybe it's simpler to just know you want to turn to the sides or to the front or back. This recommendation is based on our preference votes. So more than half the participants preferred the continuous option, and then the next most popular was that 8-level option. And this was statistically significant. To give you some ideas of what the participants were saying, one person said, the more precise the direction, the better it is. Another person highlighted these trade-offs between the different options, saying 8-level is easier to locate than 4-level, continuous is too specific, so highlighting that potential issue of too much information. Now let me highlight a few other design dimensions. Simultaneous indicators. Participants thought that 4 to 5 overlapping speakers would be enough to satisfy most of their needs and not be too overwhelming. And some users may want to, of course, customize this attribute. Another desired attribute was loudness. So you could imagine conveying loudness using different sizes of ripples or different sizes of arrows pointing in the direction that sound's coming from. And then finally, automatic sound recognition features were quite popular. So people wanted, in particular, speaker identity information, differentiating between speech and non-speech sounds, like paper rustling on the table, for example, and automatic captioning. Now, based on all of those findings, we moved on to a second study where we first built a proof of concept prototype, and then we evaluated it with a small number of participants. Our prototype looks partly like this. So what we had for this prototype was a wearable display, Google Glass, which I'll get to in a minute, and then we had a non-wearable sound sensor. So this is from our collaborators in computer science. In the middle of this table, there's something that looks a little bit like a Death Star, and it's actually a real space audio sensor with a 64 microphone array, which is able to locate sound in 3D space. This is connected to a laptop that's running sound localization beamforming software. And then in turn, that's connected to the Google Glass head-mounted display, which the participant wore. This provided real-time visualizations of sound that was occurring in the room. And I'm going to show you a video clip here of how this looked from the wearer's perspective. And you'll see this screen in the middle of the video is actually the head-mounted display, and there's going to be an arrow moving around as people speak.
But I'll be right back in case you need me.
I just realized something. We've never had a completely successful test with any of the equipment.
I blame myself.
So do I.
But there's no sense worrying about it now.
So to evaluate this prototype, once we'd built it, we recruited 4 new participants with hearing loss. They were aged 26 to 42, and again, there were 2 males and 2 females. We had them use 2 implementations of our visualizations. These were complementary designs that were fairly popular in the earlier study. And they completed both scripted and open-ended conversations with small groups of research assistants around that table that you just saw in the video clip. Now, to give you a sense of some of the feedback that we got, I first want to play a video clip of one of the participants talking about her experience wearing the device as somebody walked into the room behind her.
When we went back and forth, it was clear, it was like pum, pum, pum. And then for the Ghostbusters one, when you were standing behind me and you spoke, it was just like right there. So I knew you were speaking.
All right, so I like that clip because it emphasizes that importance of localization and providing through a visual display some of that sound information that the wearer would not otherwise have been aware of. We received both positive comments on the system as well as practical suggestions. So here's a positive comment that ties into one of the earlier themes. This approach would be helpful because my sound processor is not able to point where the sound is coming from. So again, emphasizing that importance of sound localization. Interestingly, though, another participant said, my hearing friends would want me to understand better by real conversation rather than expecting to read from Google Glass. So there's this idea that we would like to explore further about how and when people would like their conversation to be mediated through a technology and when they wouldn't. So in terms of some takeaways, we found that head-mounted display sound visualizations show promise for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and we came up with a set of specific design recommendations for supporting group conversation. Now, this is just the early exploratory stages of this work, and there are a number of directions that we are excited about exploring. So I'll give you a few ideas about what those look like. We're interested in looking at sound awareness needs across a wider variety of contexts, not just that group conversation scenario. We're also, of course, wanting to build and evaluate a wearable sensing approach. So the collaborators of mine on this project in computer science have been looking at wearable microphone arrays that are lightweight compared to that array that was sitting on the table, maybe only have 4 or 8 microphones, for example. We're also wanting to explore advanced recognition features like speaker identification and captioning. How can you provide this information to be useful without overwhelming the user? All right, so let's move on to a second project now. This project is on providing language support for people who have an acquired language impairment. And again, we're using head-mounted displays here, so there is some overlap with the previous project in that way. Our target here is to focus on people who have aphasia, which is an acquired language impairment, typically due to damage to the brain, often from a stroke. And aphasia can affect any of the language modalities, speaking, reading, writing, listening. And it can manifest in different ways depending on the individual. I would like to give you a little example of one of our participants with aphasia speaking about the technology idea that we've just presented to him to give you a sense of what it is like for some individuals with aphasia to communicate.
Talk.
Are there kinds of conversations you would want to have?
Yeah.
Like what?
All kinds of words in my mouth. All kinds of words come out all the time, but I can't say it. Good.
So you notice that he had trouble saying the specific words that he wanted to say, and that's the problem that we're trying to address in this research. Now, existing solutions out there to support this problem are called Augmentative and Alternative Communication Technologies, or AAC technologies. And this slide shows one example called Proloquo to Go, which is a mobile app that you can use on your tablet or your iPhone, and it contains a dictionary of pictures, text, and sound. Now, and you know, you go through and you'd find the words that you want to say in here, and then the device could potentially read those words aloud for you, or you could try to speak them yourself after seeing the pictures and the text and listening to the sound. Now, for people with aphasia, AAC adoption remains low. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that the technology, this kind of support is external to the user typically. So you need to look away from your conversation partner down to your smartphone or your tablet, and that diverts attention. It can be socially awkward. It makes it harder to read the facial expressions and other visual cues that someone with aphasia would be trying to use in order to communicate effectively. This external device can also call attention to the disability. So especially if when you're browsing through it, Maybe it's using text-to-speech and generating sound. And so this sort of interacts with these issues of stigma and assistive technology and the individual's desire to not have attention drawn to the fact that they're using language support. And then thirdly, this kind of solution tends to replace rather than augment speech. And there are reasons for that are both because of this text-to-speech that the device may be generating, as well as while the person is browsing through the device, maybe their communication partner can actually see what's going on the screen. So by the time you find the word that you want, the device may have preempted you and already spoken it, or maybe the other person's already read that word, and now you no longer need to speak, and that autonomy is being taken away from you. So we're looking at how head-mounted displays can address these types of challenges. So for example, this is a scenario that we showed to participants in our first study. This woman is going to the grocery store. She needs to buy some cheddar cheese, but she can't express that word. She's having trouble. It's sort of on the tip of her tongue, but she can't actually say it. So she uses her head-mounted display, searches for the cheese category. She's maybe loaded her grocery list onto this head-mounted display to start with. She finds cheddar cheese. She sees the picture. She sees the text. Maybe she listens to some audio output on that private audio output that's on the HMD device. And then based on maybe the text or the audio output, that can allow her to speak those words for herself. And she asks a clerk to tell her where the cheddar cheese is. So that's the idea. We built here another proof of concept prototype, again with Google Glass. And so imagine you're a participant in our study and you want to talk about with the researcher the fact that you went to a concert last week and it was really fun, but you can't think of the word concert, or you can't say the word concert. So you would scroll through these categories on the device that show images, text, and sound. Find this personalized category with your hobbies, scroll down to concert, and then you get that prompt that can help you speak for yourself. So to date, we've conducted 3 studies looking at this idea, and I'm going to tell you about the second one in depth and then the third one briefly. The second one was a qualitative lab and field evaluation of that proof of concept prototype that I just showed you. So here we recruited 14 participants with aphasia. They had at most moderate language deficits, and they were on average 61 years old. They completed a conversation task both in the lab. This was an autobiographical task where the device was preceded with information that was relevant to them, so favorite foods, recent vacations, and hobbies, for example. And then they went to a local market and they completed a task with an unfamiliar conversation partner in the field. This is important because this is where language support is most needed. If you're at home or you're talking to your friends, they'll know that you have aphasia, and they'll also likely have strategies to communicate with you. But if you go off to, say, the grocery store and you're talking to somebody new, they don't know you have aphasia, so you need to maybe explain that or to try and communicate without explaining that. So this is a difficult communication scenario. The tasks that we had people do were ask for this item, which is a pumpkin, but of course we didn't say the word pumpkin because we didn't want to prompt them to be able to say it, just repeat it after us. And then ask if this bakery item contains this common allergen, a muffin containing nuts. After these tasks, there was a semi-structured interview component. All of this data was transcribed and coded using thematic analysis, and then we validated the coding with a researcher external to our research team. So I'd like to give you an overview of 4 of the themes that came out of this study. One was that participants appreciated the glanceability of the display, so their ability to maintain visual awareness on their conversation partner while making use of the display. For example, one person said, "My focus was right on the money. He," meaning the clerk, "was standing right there, and I can see him and I can see the pumpkin on the display." Another person said, "Oh yeah, I could read her nonverbal communication." There was also a strong role seen for the use of this kind of technology in the public context versus that lab context where it was a one-on-one with somebody that they already knew. So for example, busy place and friends or enemies, enemies meaning unfamiliar conversation partners, then the HMD has really a much livelier or stronger role. Another theme that arose was support for independent communication. One person said, for example, I would never have thought to do that myself, meaning go to the grocery store and ask about the muffin or the pumpkin. No, I would go with my wife, she would help me, and I would have to point. And then the fourth theme, participants appreciated the private display and its ability to support their own speech. And the private display was, again, both in terms of the visual information that was presented, as well as that auditory information on that speaker just on the arm of the device. One person said, for example, I can't say it, but I know what it is, so this device can say it for me, and then I'll say it. All right, so following that study, which showed that there is promise for head-mounted displays to provide this kind of language support for individuals with aphasia, we conducted a follow-up study where we compared information presented on the head-mounted display to information presented on the smartphone, our sort of status quo AAC technology solution. And this was exactly the same information, just presented on the two different types of device. I'm going to only briefly tell you about this study. We had 20 participants with aphasia come in, play a Go Fish card game where you have to ask questions about what card the other person's holding, so we're going back and forth. And then they used either the HMD or the smartphone to support this communication. In terms of results, we found that the HMD resulted in significantly faster time per turn than the smartphone, so more efficient communication. And in terms of some qualitative results, again, the privacy of the display was valued, and some participants also commented on some of these practical questions that we're interested in looking at in future work, of course, about aesthetics and mainstream devices. So the display was seen as, Google Glass is not a mainstream device, even though it's received a lot of popular press, both bad and good, in the last few years. And so they were worried that that device would draw attention to the fact that they were using this kind of technology. So in terms of takeaways, we found that the HMD was successfully used in a public context. And again, this is important because that's a very difficult communication scenario. And our participants here didn't have much experience with this kind of technology in the first place. So this, we consider this to be a big success. The glanceable private nature of the display was valued. And we also found that the HMD provided increased communication efficiency over the smartphone. Now, for next steps here, there are also many, many directions that this research could go that we're excited about. For example, how much vocabulary do we see the display with, and what vocabulary do we show? Should we use machine learning algorithms to detect context and automatically provide a few vocabulary items that might be most relevant to a particular situation? Who do we target with this technology? Who might benefit from it the most? And in what contexts is the support most valuable? So in terms of who do we target, probably individuals who have intact audio comprehension and mild speech deficits, so that they're able to speak for themselves once they've been provided with a prompt, as opposed to somebody who is not going to be able to speak those words at all. So those were our first two projects looking at providing information on a head-mounted display. And very briefly, I would like to introduce you to a third project that doesn't look at head-mounted displays, but again, is a wearable device augmenting users' abilities. And here, what we're doing is augmenting physical touch for blind users. We're using tiny cameras that are 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter, and these are typically used for endoscopies. And we're basically looking at how we can augment a person's fingers with these cameras and appropriate computer vision algorithms to provide non-tactile information through other modalities like audio. So we're addressing daily activities like reading printed text, providing mobile computing access, and supporting somebody in coordinating clothing colors and dressing themselves. And I'll give you one example video here. This is one of our early prototypes, and somebody using it to read a printed page. They're going to run their finger along those lines of text, and you'll hear the text-to-speech generated as the system is automatically doing optical character recognition.
Amy, dog, owner Wood, testified that dogs are just as prone to jealousy as humans.
So our goal through all of these projects that I've talked to you about today has been to augment user abilities by harnessing computational methods like machine learning, computer vision, and computational linguistics, and by leveraging emerging wearable technologies and new technologies that we're building ourselves, new wearable technologies, to address these everyday actions in like connecting, shopping, reading, and taking public transit, to ensure that these actions, these activities are not only accessible to people with a range of sensory, cognitive, and physical abilities, but are also enjoyable. And I think that with wearable technologies and embedded computation that we're seeing more and more of these days, we have a tremendous opportunity now to be able to address these issues. So I hope that you'll, some of you at least, will join me in that pursuit. On that note, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'll take some questions.